Hello everyone! Yes, I'm actually talking to you in front of the camera. So if I appear nervous and awkward, it's because I am. I figured today it would be better to actually explain the video before going straight into the sewing, or else I get the feeling that you wouldn't understand what the hell I was going on about. So this video is going to be inspired by the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I say the book because I'm specifically inspired by the quote, "Paint the roses red." Now, I only put the title as Alice in Wonderland to save space on the words. Here are some awful drawings of my initial design and thinking, so you understand where I'm coming from when I go into the sewing. It's going to be a corset with both red and white panels. Now, I think my end design will be slightly different because, drawing isn't my strong suit. I want it to be asymmetrical with flowers trailing down, and perhaps the eyelets will be the opposite colour to the fabric on the back. I definitely want the red and white theme sort of going through it. And as you can probably tell, I want to do like a card tutu around the outside to sort of go with that whole Queen of Hearts thing in the book. I don't know whether there'll be two parts to this video. There probably will, just one for the corset, then one for the tutu and flower decorations, but as of yet when I'm recording this, I really don't know. I guess things might change as I go through it, which I'll probably talk to you about when I do that voiceover in the sewing process. But yeah, I'm really inspired by this book because I think it's amazing, and I love Alice in Wonderland, the book, the films, the original Disney film and the one by Tim Burton, as well as Alice Through the Looking Glass. And if you're watching it and you're bored and you just want to see what I end up getting up to, then I hope you enjoy this video. Also, I might include some facts here and there because, if you watch my other videos, you might notice that I like that kind of thing. Anyway, let's get on with the sewing. First, I started by creating a mock-up for my design. I have an unorthodox method when it comes to developing a pattern to begin with. I adjust my mannequin to my size, then cover it with masking tape ready to draw on. Then I pen my design onto the tape, ensuring to draw in the centre front and centre back. I draw all the panels I want in my design, and usually I only design half a pattern, but I have to cover my whole mannequin when it comes to an asymmetric design. I ended up wanting 8 panels altogether for the bodice, plus a front and back piece for the strap. I didn't include footage of me transferring my tape panels to paper. Fortunately, luck was on my side and it required minimum changes, which is why I like my strange method of mock-ups so much. Once I had perfected my mock-up, I moved on to cutting out the fabric pieces. This is footage of me cutting out the black coutil fabric that will be sandwiched between the outer satin layer and the inner red cotton lining. Just a warning before continuing, there are a lot of layers of fabric in this corset, but I think I show it quite well once all the fabric pieces are cut. I cut 2 of all the other panels in coutil, and I remembered to cut the notches in as well. The facts in this video will be a mixture of facts from the books and about Lewis Carroll, as well as anything else relating to it. I managed to collect around 30 facts for this, which is crazy, and I certainly enjoyed the research that went along with it. Fact 1. The book was published on the 26th of November 1865 by Macmillan Publishers. Fact 2. The book has a sequel called Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. Fact 3. It was made into a Disney film on the 26th of July 1951. I then repeated the cutting process for the cotton lining of the corset, but I excluded the centre back panels, which I didn't need. Fact 4. It was later created into a live-action film on the 25th of February 2010. Fact 5. The live-action film was directed by Tim Burton, giving the film his classic dark style. Fact 6. What you might not know is that Walt Disney was not the first to make Alice's Adventures in Wonderland a film. Directors Cecil Hepworth and Percy Stowe made the story into a 12-minute film in 1903. Because it was at the beginning of the century, this was actually the longest film produced in Britain so far. Hepworth played the Frog Footman and his wife was cast as the White Rabbit and the Queen. Fact 7. The book illustrations are by Sir John Tenniel. Next, I cut the one centre back panel on the fold from white satin, then one front panel, back panel and back strap panel from all the white satin as well. Fact 8. Lewis Carroll's real name was Charles Ludwig Dodgson. He started using the pen name Lewis Carroll in 1856 when he published a romantic poem. It was a play on a Latin translation of his real first and middle names. Other options he gave the editor to choose from were Edgar Cuthwellis, Edgar U.C. Westhill, and Lewis Carroll, but spelt differently. Fact 9. Carroll had many jobs, including a novelist, a mathematician, a clergyman, a photographer, and an artist. Fact 10. Carroll's main job was as a mathematician and he worked at the Christ Church College at Oxford. Then I sorted through my pattern pieces to find which panels I needed to cut out of the red satin. I have plenty of notes on the pattern pieces, so I know all I need to before I cut anything out of my precious fabric. This time I cut one centre back panel on the fold from the red satin, just like I did with the white satin, but I also cut two centre front panels from the red satin as I wanted more red panels than white, so the front will be more red than white. I cut one front panel, one back panel and the front strap panel from the red satin next. Fact 11. The name Alice was used because it was the daughter of Carroll's boss. Henry Liddell, Carroll's boss, was the dean of Christ Church College. Carroll formed a friendship with Henry Liddell, his wife Lorena, I don't think I'm saying that right, and their entire family. He took this photograph of Alice, Ina, Harry and Edith Liddell in the summer of 1860. Fact 12. The little sisters in the Dormouse's story, Elsie, Lacey and Tilly, are references to Liddell's three daughters. Lorena Charlotte's initials became Elsie, Lacey is an anagram of Alice, and Tilly was short for Matilda, a nickname given to Edith. Fact 13. Most of his story ideas were formed when on boating trips with the Liddell family, because that is when the children wanted to hear his stories. Here are all my paper pattern pieces laid out in order. There isn't any cotton lining pieces for the centre back panel. There's 2 cotton lining pieces for the back panel, 2 for the front panel, 2 for the centre front panel and 1 of each for the strap panels. Next there is 2 pieces of black couture for the centre back, 2 for the back panel, 2 for the front panel, 2 for the centre front panel. Then ignore the pieces of couture for the strap panels because I don't end up using them. Next there is a white satin piece cut on the fold for the centre back. And a red one. 2 pieces for the front and back, 1 white and 1 red. 2 for the front panel, 1 of each colour. 2 pieces for the centre front panel, both of red satin. Then 1 red satin piece for the front strap and 1 white satin piece for the back strap. These are all the fabric pieces for the corset. I know, it's a lot. I think there's about 28 pieces of fabric altogether. Now after this, I decided I wanted to laminate the satin pieces of fabric to the couture pieces because it will give a smoother finish to the corset while still holding great structure. It involves getting lamination paper and ironing it on one side of the fabric, then sticking it to the other and pressing it again. And I had my mum help me with this because I'm a hazard when it comes to ironing. Finally, it was time to start actually sewing, although I do have to admit I enjoy the pattern making and cutting stage of a project because I'm still excited for what's coming and not as stressed yet, which is always inevitable at some stage in a project. I tried pinning the panels together, but the fabric was quite thick after I laminated it, so I decided to wing it under the machine without pins, a very bad idea most of the time, but you know the saying, do as I say and not what I do. This definitely applies here. I sew the centre front panels right sides together, ensuring to match up the notches, and then connected the front panels to either side of them and so on until all the panels were connected, and then I repeat this process for the lining layer of the corset. Fact 14. The Mad Hatter from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland wouldn't have existed without the Liddell children persisting on him telling the story. He writes this in his diary and eventually he turns it into a written novel to give to Alice as a Christmas present. A year later and the book was self-published by Carroll, and it had doubled in length to consist of many more characters that he invented for the children. Here is the result after. It looks bumpy and slightly creased when just laid out on my table, but it is smooth and nice fitting when I wrap it around me. What I didn't realise until I had laid it out in front of me after being sewn, I saw that I had tabs to connect the straps to on both sides of the corset, which of course isn't right because it's supposed to be asymmetric, so I trimmed off the edge of the side that isn't having a strap. Next, it was time to attach the strap panels to the corset. I used an army of pins to secure the satin front and back strap pieces to the corset, making sure to ease in the fabric and match up the notches. I also do this with the lining layer. Fact 15. The book almost wasn't called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. In his diary, Carroll had referred to it as Alice's Adventures Underground, all ready to give to Alice Liddell. Other potential names were Alice's Hour in Elfland or Alice Among the Fairies. Fact 16. Tenniel, the illustrator of the book, hated the first edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland because of how badly his drawings had been reproduced in them. Half of the back strap for the lining layer goes off the edge and looks a bit strange. This is because there's no centre back lining panels, so the back strap doesn't have anything to be connected to yet, but you'll see what I did to make this right later. It just looks a little strange right now. Next, I sew the strap panels to the corset, making sure to match up the notches as I remove my pin army. I do this for the lining layer too. Fact 17. Carroll chose to spend more than half of his annual salary to get the book reprinted, leaving him short of money before the book even came out, but of course the book was eventually a success once published. Fact 18. Alice was originally brunette, not blonde in the illustrations. After this, I pushed the seams of the straps downwards towards the corset and pin in place. I am doing this because I want to top stitch it down so it appears less bulky. I use my narrow foot on my sewing machine to top stitch the strap seam down so I can get as close to the edge as possible, and I of course switch thread colours for the white and red parts. This stitch probably won't be visible on the corset anyway because of the roses covering it, but I still want it to be as neat as possible just in case. Now was the crazy task of putting the lining into the corset, which I want to match up as closely as possible to look neat, plus it will create the boning channels in the corset later. I ensure the seams are open on both the front layer and the lining layer before pressing them together and starting from the centre front and I feel around as I pin to keep it in place and look underneath before continuing as I go down. I carry on with this technique for the other seams as well. I specifically do this with the seams as I want these to match up the most, rather than just randomly pinning in the middle of the panels for the corset. For the centre back panels, obviously there isn't a lining layer for it because the satin is there, sandwiching the coutil for a smooth edge that I won't have to bind later on. Because of this, I trim the seam of the centre back panels that connect it to the back panel. Then I take the lining material and fold it under the centre back seam, like a felled seam that I will sew down to neaten it and secure it in place. For the centre back side with the white back strap attached to it, it was a little more fiddly and complicated, but I basically did the same thing as the other side by trimming the seam down. I folded the lining fabric over the satin seam like the other side. Then I also took the lining strap underneath the satin strap seam to achieve the same effect. And I quickly put a few pins through the strap, satin and lining to keep them together. Next it was time to connect the outer layer and the lining layer together, which I did by sewing right next to each seam of the corset on both sides. Not only does this connect the layers together, but it is the start of the boning channels that will be added later on. I used my narrow foot again and top stitch right next to the seam lines. As you can see, the army of pins I put in the lining layer is at the back, so I have to lift up the corset every time I want to remove a pin, which may seem awkward, but it was easier at the pinning stage and I would prefer this to the alternative because I can feel where the pins are as I sew. Fact 19. Tenniel's original illustrations were actually carved into wood. This was because of the printing process back then. His drawings were on paper, then they were carved onto wood blocks by engravers, which were then made into metal electrotype reproductions to be used in the printing process. After this, I needed to hand sew the felled edges of the centre back panels because I wanted to make sure it was super secure and I didn't want those lines showing at the front of the corset. I only picked up a few threads of the satin when I sew so it doesn't go to the front of the corset. As I've said in other videos, hand sewing isn't my strong suit and I get frustrated with it easily, so my stitches aren't the smallest or neatest, but I don't think they're too bad considering, and at least it's on the inside of the corset. Now it was time to mark the corset ready to sew in the boning channels. I start with marking the centre back boning channels. I mark 1 centimetre away from the edge of the centre back to make the first channel. Then I had to remember that there would be eyelets here, so I put a gap of 1.5 centimetres between the first channels and the second. I sew these channels under the machine, trying to keep them as straight as possible, and I ensure that the boning channels are all 1 centimetre thick so the plastic will fit in later on. Here's an illustration that I made to show where I placed the boning channels, which is pretty simple because there is one each side of every seam of the corset. Once I had marked the channels for the centre back, I may have got slightly bored and decided not to mark the rest because I could just follow the stitch lines next to each seam and use the edge of my foot as the measurement because it happens to be 1 centimetre away from the needle. Perfect. After, I sew the strap panels together after doing a final fit test to see where the strap sits on my shoulder. I also open the strap seams out and fold them under and top stitch over them so there isn't any raw edges showing and it looks nice and neat underneath. Next came the binding of the top edge of the corset. I placed the bias binding edge in line with the edge of the corset and sew 1 centimetre away from the edge. I leave some excess binding at the edge of the corset because it will be folded under when completing the other side of binding, so everything is nice and neat. I ease the binding around the curves of the corset as I go along. I am careful when I come to the centre front of the corset because I want the binding to be pointed, so I sew and then turn the corset under my machine and then carry on. I am also careful when it comes to transitioning to the strap because it's quite thick at the seam and it goes on to less fabric with the strap. so I go slowly and continue. I made the binding off camera once again by cutting 3cm bias strips of white satin and sewing them all together into one very long strip. I then started to bind the armhole of my corset. As you can see, I folded over a section of the binding at the underarm seam, which is a good trick I learnt when binding circles, because when it is later folded over, there will be no raw edge. I decided I wanted to bind my corset with the white satin, which I think I made the right choice because it really brings the red and white together. Now it was time for preparing and inserting the boning. I measure along the boning channel and minus 1.5 centimetres away from the measurement when I cut the plastic boning with pliers, because I am accounting for the bottom edge that still needs to be binded later on. Then I have to sand down the sharp edges of the boning so they will be rounded and there's no risk of the plastic piercing the fabric when it's in the corset. Then I insert the boning into the channel. Then it's repeated many times for all of the channels. Measure, cut, sand, insert. After I have removed my fingerprints from my hands with all that sanding, I sew the bottom line of binding onto my corset, which I completed off camera. I then moved on to turning the binding over to the inside. First I like to put a few stitches into the folded over binding so I know it will stay in place, and I leave a long edge because I have cut it too short before and ends up poking out the edge of the corset later on. Then I turn my binding inwards and start hand sewing it down, ensuring to hide the stitch lines of the other side of the corset that I sewed with the machine. After this, it was time to hand sew plenty of eyelets in. I mark where I want the eyelets to be first, and then I use different tools to widen the eyelet hole. First my awl, then my embroidery scissors, and then a small makeup brush I have because it seems to be the perfect size for an eyelet hole in a corset. I thread up the needle with some embroidery floss and begin to sew around the hole I made. I make sure to saturate the hole and I try to keep it even all the way round, which I often fail at. I decided to use the opposite colour thread to the fabric so it is more visible, and it's another interesting feature of my original design. Fact 20. There are theories about Carroll ridiculing math in his children's story. Carroll was a conservative mathematician, so he found the new forms of math emerging in the middle 1800s strange. A mathematician called Keith Devlin guessed that the quote, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" said by the Mad Hatter in Carroll's book could be an example of Carroll mocking others in his field. Devlin suggests that the riddles were a reflection on increased abstraction that was going on in mathematics in the 19th century. Finally, I thread up my corset with some white satin ribbon and the basic corset is finished. It feels weird calling it a basic corset because of how much work went into it, but in my next video I will show you how I make a crazy card tutu to go with my corset. I'll also be decorating my corset with chiffon flowers and some embroidery of the quote that inspired this project. Hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you so much for watching this video and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll try and get the second part of this project out as soon as possible. If you want to check my progress as I go through my projects, then you're more than welcome to follow me on Instagram. But anyway, hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye!